Let's take a deep dive together into one of the most shocking defeats in Roman history. We're going back to the year 53 BC. The main character of our story is Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was one of the three main powers in Rome, alongside Caesar and Pompey. You could say he was the wealthiest man in the entire empire, but it seems all that wealth wasn't enough, and he was thirsty for military glory, something on the scale of Caesar's or Pompey's victories. So with a massive army, which interestingly he had raised with his own money, he set off for the east without even waiting for the Senate's approval and marched straight into the heart of the Parthian domain. He thought it would be an easy job, a quick and total victory, but he had no idea what fate and what a nightmare was on its way and awaiting him. Crassus was entering a battlefield whose rules of engagement were completely alien to him. The Parthians, especially under the command of Surena, their young and brilliant general, were masters of guerrilla warfare and surprise attacks. Today, we want to see exactly how excessive ambition, miscalculations, and underestimating the enemy led to that great disaster at Carrhae. So, what were Crassus's exact motivations? It wasn't just that thirst for fame. It was a combination of different factors. Jealousy of Caesar's and Pompey's military successes certainly played a huge role. The lust for the legendary wealth of the East was also a factor. The Parthian Empire was incredibly rich. Alongside these, there was also a kind of false pride and overconfidence. Crassus and many Romans thought the Parthians were just like the other Eastern powers they had previously defeated, meaning they imagined them to be weak. Well, that was a huge mistake. Interestingly, Crassus didn't even listen to the warnings of his own ally, the king of Armenia. Artavasdes II had suggested a safer route to him. He told him to come through the mountains of Armenia, where the path was safer and he could provide reinforcements. But Crassus arrogantly refused, saying, "No, I'm taking the direct route, right through the middle of the Mesopotamian desert. A straight path, but a deadly one." He basically walked right into the heart of danger on his own 2 feet. Now let's get to the armies. The Roman army was huge. Sources say it numbered around 40,000 to 43,000 men. Its core was the famous Roman legionaries, heavy infantry. Alongside them, they had light and heavy cavalry, most of whom were from Gaul. All in all, a classic and powerful Roman army. In contrast, Surena's army was much smaller, perhaps around 10,000 men, all of whom were cavalry. But the composition of these 10,000 was key. About 1,000 of them were cataphracts, the super heavy armored cavalry who were like the tanks of the ancient world. Both rider and horse had full armor and were a terrifying striking force. The other 9,000 were horse archers who were extremely skilled, fast, and mobile. So Rome had the quantity, but Parthia had the quality and specialization, especially for this type of battle. The Parthians didn't just rely on their tactical superiority, they also masterfully used psychological warfare. Before the main engagement began, Surena ordered enormous drums to be sounded. These drums were covered with animal hides and filled with bells and metal objects. They produced a very strange, deep, hollow, and eerie sound that the Romans had reportedly never heard before, and it had a significant negative impact on their morale. Then, as they got closer, Surena did something else. At first, he had the shiny, polished armor of the cataphracts covered with dark cloths. Then he suddenly ordered the cloths to be thrown off. Imagine, under the scorching desert sun, the sudden blinding glare of 1,000 armored horsemen. What a visual and psychological shock that must have been for the Romans. Crassus initially wanted to arrange his forces in a long line to attack with the full power of his infantry, but he realized he would quickly outflanked by the swift Parthian cavalry. So he quickly changed his order and told them to form a hollow square. This meant the legionaries formed a large square able to defend from all four sides, with the baggage and light cavalry placed in the middle. This might be a good defensive formation, but it makes the army incredibly slow and immobile, and you lose all maneuverability. This was exactly what Surena wanted. Now, the Parthian horse archers, who were very fast, could easily circle this square and, from a safe distance, rain down a shower of arrows on the Romans' heads. And this wasn't ordinary archery. They used composite bows, which were multi-layered and made from wood, animal horn, and sinew. Their power and range were far greater than the simple Roman bows. It's reported that the Parthian arrows were so powerful they could pierce the large shields of the legionaries, the scutum, and sometimes even pin two legionaries together. The Roman legionaries, masters of hand-to-hand combat, were practically trapped. They had become a large, stationary target and couldn't get close to the enemy. Whatever they did was useless. Even the famous testudo or tortoise formation, where they held their shields overhead and on all sides, didn't help much. Because when they packed together like that, they became a perfect target for the crushing, concentrated charges of the cataphracts. It was out of the frying pan and into the fire. The Romans must have been hoping the Parthian arrows would eventually run out. But Surena had a plan for that too. He had organized an incredible supply system. Thousands of camels behind the battle lines carried loads of arrows and relentlessly resupplied the archers. This meant the archery never stopped. For a Roman soldier, this psychological pressure was no less than the physical wounds from the arrows themselves. It was at this point that Crassus decided to make an offensive move. In a desperate attempt, he ordered his son, Publius, with a significant portion of his forces, including the best Gallic cavalry and some infantry, to attack the archers, at least to give the army a chance to breathe. But this was exactly what the Parthians were waiting for. It was a trap. The Parthian archers, according to the plan, began a tactical retreat, pretending to flee. The young and fame-seeking Publius recklessly pursued them, separating his forces from the main body of the army and luring them to a more distant area. Suddenly, the archers turned back, and at the same time, the heavy-armored cataphracts, who were lying in ambush, charged from another direction. Publius's force was completely surrounded. Almost all 6,000 of them were killed, and perhaps only 500 were taken prisoner. Publius himself, seeing that defeat was certain and not wanting to be captured, either killed himself or ordered one of his loyal guards to kill him. The final blow came when the Parthians mounted Publius's severed head on a spear and paraded it before his father and the Roman soldiers. Seeing this scene completely destroyed the morale of the Roman army. Crassus tried to control himself and encourage his soldiers, saying, "This is my personal loss," but it was no use. The will to fight was gone. At night, in a completely disorganized manner, they began to retreat towards the nearby city of Carrhae. But this retreat was another disaster. They left behind about 4,000 wounded men who couldn't walk, right there on the battlefield, all of whom were killed by the Parthians the next morning. The next day, Surena appeared again and offered Crassus negotiations for a truce and safe passage. Crassus himself was reluctant. Perhaps he was afraid, or his pride wouldn't allow it. But his soldiers were at their breaking point and practically forced him to go negotiate. During the negotiations, a verbal dispute or misunderstanding apparently broke out, and the situation escalated to violence. Crassus and almost all his senior officers were killed on the spot. There is also the famous story of molten gold being poured down Crassus's throat, which they say the Parthians did to mock his insatiable greed. Perhaps this is just a legend or propaganda, but it has become very famous as a symbol of the humiliating end of this campaign. This battle was a total disaster for Rome. It's estimated that about 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed and 10,000 were captured, one of the heaviest military defeats in all of Roman history. In contrast, Parthian casualties were reported to be very, very low. One of the things that was very humiliating for the Romans was the loss of the legionary standards, the golden eagles, aquila, which were the symbol of their power and honor and were now in enemy hands. Years later, Emperor Augustus succeeded in getting the eagles back through diplomacy, which was considered a great political victory for him. Furthermore, the death of Crassus effectively shattered the triumvirate between himself, Caesar, and Pompey. Crassus had, in a way, served as a balancing force between the other two. With his death, this balance was upset, and the rivalry between Caesar and Pompey intensified, ultimately leading to the famous Roman Civil War. So the defeat at Carrhae also impacted the fate of Rome itself. And one more bitter note, the fate of Surena himself, the victorious commander of this battle. The Parthian king Orodes II grew fearful of the power and popularity Surena gained after this great victory, became jealous of him, and unfortunately, instead of rewarding him, ordered his execution. Ultimately, this battle showed the Romans that they were not invincible and established the border between the two empires on the Euphrates River for centuries. The shadow of this defeat would hang over Roman-Parthian relations for a long time. This story shows us how a dangerous combination of excessive pride, underestimating an opponent, and failing to understand the conditions of the battlefield can bring even the most powerful empires and commanders to their knees.